Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're making another Risk of Rain 2 item tier list. Today we're going over the yellow items. These are some of my personal favorite items in the game that can single-handedly change runs, and even if they don't, they're still exciting to get. But first, really quickly, I would just like to remind everybody that liking and subscribing are both greatly appreciated. They tell me that you like my content, and they help tell YouTube that they should show my content to more people. But without further ado, let's jump right into the video. Starting off the list, we have the Charged Perforator, which is honestly just ATG, but better. As such, it's going straight into the S tier. There's not a whole lot else to say about it. It does an absurd amount of damage, it has its own proc chance, and is a welcome sight on every survivor in every build. Next we have the Defense Nucleus, which is going to go into the C tier. The Defense Nucleus honestly is not a bad item, especially if you're going to be looping or going through a lot of stages. Having an extra 4 allies to distract enemies and do a little extra damage is pretty helpful, and especially when looping or fighting void seeds that have void touched enemies, you're almost guaranteed to cap out on how many alpha constructs you can spawn with this item. With that said though, it has very little use in the final boss fights, meaning Mithrix and the Voidling. While both bosses do have phases where enemies spawn, for Mithrix the chance of an elite spawning is pretty rare unless you're pretty far into the loops, and for Voidling, your Alpha Construct allies are likely to spawn too far away to help with the fight. Empathy Cores are next, and they're going to go into the A tier. This might be a bit of a hot take because when Mithrix steals your Empathy Cores, his Soulless Probes can do a lot of damage really quickly. But as someone that does like picking up drones throughout the run when I have extra money, Empathy Cores are a welcome sight. They do a lot of damage and synergize extremely well with the spare drone parts red item. With that said though, if you haven't been picking up drones, I would definitely consider scrapping this item before going to Mithrix. Next we have the Genesis Loop, which is going to go into the C tier. The reason it's not going to go any higher is because it's extremely hard to abuse this item. Setting up a build where the Genesis Loop procs constantly is very difficult, and although it can be really helpful on Engineer because his turrets can proc Genesis Loops, I wouldn't recommend it on any other survivor. The Halcyon Seed is up next, and this is kind of an interesting item that I recently changed my mind on. I used to think that going to the Gilded Coast was never worth it, because Aurelian Knight didn't do that much damage, and it was a waste of time, making the game harder. But more recently I've realized that taking a golden portal actually stops the timer. The Gilded Coast has 4 free items on it, and while Aurelian Knight doesn't do very much damage, he can be very useful in the fight against Mithrix during the 4th phase. He can take Mithrix's aggro, and can do enough damage to help get your items back. There is one significant downside to the Halcyon Seed though, and that is the fact that Aurelian Knight can become void touched, which makes him incredibly dangerous to you. It pays to be very careful if there are void corruptors around, and you have the Halcyon Seed in your inventory. But other than that, I think it is always worth picking up. The Irradiant Pearl is up next, and I'm sure to no one's surprise, this is going to the very top of S tier. The Irradiant Pearl is really kind of a disgustingly good item. Although there are some quirks to its scaling that make its health regen and armor multiplier less useful, it is still a single item that gives 10% health, 10% movement speed, 10% damage, 10% attack speed, and 10% crit chance. All in one item. That's pretty gross. If I'm going to be looping on a run, I try to pick up as many non-detrimental blue items as possible, so when I do find a cleansing pool, I can gamble for 1 or 2 Irradiant Pearls. Little Disciple is up next, and this one's also going into the S tier. In a lot of ways, the Little Disciple is like a zero downside egocentrism. It does a lot of damage, it helps with some characters who have difficulty proccing items, and it makes melee survivors even more powerful. Just like all the other S tier items on my lists, Little Disciple is always worth picking up. Mired on the other hand is a bit of a mixed bag. It's not so bad anymore, because Mithrix can't take it, but most ranged survivors won't be able to take advantage of it. They'll be too far away. It can still be used on them, like closing the distance momentarily to apply the debuff or deathmark, but it has significantly less value. On melee survivors on the other hand, like Acrid and Mercenary, Mired is extremely helpful. The Tar debuff is a powerful slow, it does some damage, and it does a little bit of healing. In my opinion, a solid contender for B tier. Molten Perforator is up next, and it's going right next to its charged brother. Where the Charged Perforator was a better ATG, Molten Perforator is a slightly worse ATG. And that is for only one reason. It's pretty easy for the magma balls to miss enemies. They're very likely to not hit flying enemies at all, and if the enemy moves around a lot, like Mithrix, then it's possible that you'll only hit one, if that. But with that said, there is no downside to picking up this item. It does a lot of damage, and it stacks the Ignite debuff, which can be helpful for Deathmark. Once again, always worth picking up. The regular Pearl is next, and this one's going into the C tier. It has a pretty lackluster effect of only increasing maximum health, which is generally not that useful. It can be decent if you're doing a health stacking build with a lot of infusions, and especially on lower difficulties, extra health can synergize with certain items like Nukahana's Opinion or the Hellfire Tincture. Other than that, the best I can say is that it's unoffensive. Planula is much the same, and it's our next item on the list going into the C tier. In a lot of ways, the Planula is just a worse repulsion armor. On Eclipse 5 and above, healing is cut in half, meaning the value from this item is cut in half. So much like the Pearl, while it can have some niche uses in Monsoon and below, for the most part, I'd say the Planula is merely inoffensive. The Queen's Gland, on the other hand, has the auspicious title of being the only Scrapper tier item in the yellows, in my opinion. The reason for this is because Mithrix can take your Queen's Gland and make his fourth phase a lot more difficult to deal with. Unlike the Empathy cores though, which I rated highly despite that fact, the Queen's Gland has a large difficulty scaling into the game. Empathy core's damage stacks quite high just by buying drones and maybe getting lucky and pulling a spare drone parts. The Beetle Guard's damage doesn't scale with anything at all aside from more stacks of Queen's Gland. So in most cases, I would highly recommend scrapping this, at the very least this stage before you go to Mithrix. Our penultimate item is the Shatter Spleen, which is going into the S tier, right under a Radiant Pearl. Shatter Spleen is kind of a disgusting item. It functions similarly to Crit Glasses, Tri-Tip Dagger, and Will-o'-the-Wisp, all at the same time. 5% crit chance and bleed is really helpful against single targets, including bosses like Mithrix and the Voidling, and the powerful Explosion, for high damage plus percentage health damage, is great for mobbing situations too. All in all, Shatter Spleen is really just an incredible item. And finally, the Titanic Knurl, which is going into the C tier. Much like Pearl and Planula, it is for the most part inoffensive at best. It doesn't provide a whole lot of extra health, and the base health regen can be useful, especially early on in runs. There are very few items that synergize with the Titanic Knurl though, and as such, I have to give it a C rating. But now I want to hear what you think. What are your opinions on the boss items in Risk of Rain 2? Did I miss an important fact about one? Let me know. I love learning more about the game, and reading and responding to comments is honestly my favorite part of making these videos. But regardless, I hope you enjoyed watching, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day.